What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today we are going to talk about skill challenges. In the past couple of videos that I've done of the top 10 things that I hope they bring back for future D&D editions, or whatever they're going to end up calling one D&D, as well as the last video I did discussing the social influence system that Pathfinder 2nd Edition has, a lot of you in the comments mentioned skill challenges. That the influence system just seems like a social skill challenge, and that the 4th edition skill challenges is something that you all would like to see back in a codified form. And that's the big thing, is a lot of people talk about skill challenges like they still exist in 5th edition, when in actuality we don't have codified rules for skill challenges in 5th edition. But a wonderful thing, the old edition books still exist on DM's Guild, and the Dungeon Master's Guide for 4th edition has skill challenges, has a whole section on it. Page 72 is where it starts in the book, and it's rules agnostic. Like, it does not require any of the 4th edition mechanics for these rules to be directly applied to your game. So I'm going to go through the actual 4th edition skill challenge rules. I know a lot of people have done 5th edition skill challenge rules updates, or just broad discussion of what a skill challenge is. But I want to get into how they describe skill challenges when they introduced this system in 4th edition D&D, and how it can be used in your games to great effect. And I'll be honest, I've used skill challenges in my games before having reread these rules. I read them back in the 4th edition days, and there were some eye-opening moments for me when reading through these rules. So I hope that you all get something out of this as well, because I really do feel energized on the concept of using skill challenges. And a lot of you were right, that the influence system that I discussed is very similar, not the same, but very similar to skill challenges in their framework. So we're going to get into it, how to use it for social encounters, or even just non-social encounters, and some really fun and interesting ways that we can use skill challenges to make your game engaging and fun, especially for characters who are not combat focused. If you have a player who built a character that's a bit of a skill monkey, or a more socially focused character, and they don't really shine in combat, skill challenges are a wonderful way to make them feel integrated into the game, into the campaign, into the adventure, into the encounter, outside of a random skill check here and there. So let's get into it. Let's start with the basics. So this is just talking about what a skill challenge is and how to design a skill challenge. And so when we're thinking about skill challenges, it's a succession of skill checks, and most of them are counting towards a final tally of successes before a final tally of failures. That is the overarching framework of what we mean when we say skill challenge, is a scenario or an encounter where a certain number of successes on skill checks need to be hit before a certain number of failures. Now, first thing you need to do is define what the goal for the challenge is. So for a social encounter, a tense negotiation with a prince, you're trying to gain his favor. So obviously the goal is to get the prince to a friendly status with the party. Or it can be something much more concrete of seeking aid from the prince's court, that you all are needing some help, or the prince's resources. Maybe the prince is the commander of the army for the kingdom, and so you're needing the kingdom's army to provide resources or assistance for a great threat that's coming. So you're defining this goal when you're designing it as a dungeon master. And then the context. How are the players approaching this? How are the players coming to the prince? Are they coming hat in hand? Were the PCs captured? Like, maybe they tried to go sneak away a contingency of the army that they had friends in, and they were caught. And so the prince is coming to them like, what were you thinking? And so those two contexts are incredibly different when designing the rest of the skill challenge. So the context matters here. Now let's go on to step 2, level and complexity. Let's start with complexity. So determining the complexity for a skill challenge, you literally don't have to make any changes from the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. Complexity level 1 is 4 successes before 2 failures. And essentially, and not essentially, exactly, the formula is just twice as many successes as failures. So complexity level 1, 4 to 2. complexity level 2, 6 to 3, then 8 to 4, 10 to 5, and finally complexity level 5 is 12 to 6 ratio. So that is exactly what it says on the tin, where, you know, you have to achieve a certain number of successes, 12 successes, before 6 failed checks. And you can even go higher than this if you want to, 18 to 9 if you wanted to, because something that they talk about in here, think about a combat encounter. How many skill checks, how many checks are each player character making over the course of a combat encounter? And then when you add them all up, how many total checks was that? If it's 3 rounds of combat and you have 5 PCs, that's 15 times that the players rolled dice. So that is every roll accounted for in a complexity level 4 skill challenge, 10 and 5. Or if it's 4 rounds of combat or 5 rounds of combat, which is not uncommon in D&D combat, you're getting higher and higher amounts of skill checks. Skill checks meaning combat rolls, attack rolls, or force saving throws or anything like that. The point being that oftentimes skill challenges are disregarded as a centerpiece of a session. Oftentimes we don't want to go above the idea of like 6 or 8 successes for fear of bogging things down, when if we in actuality put the level of care and attentiveness into creating a skill challenge encounter that we do with a combat encounter, and we set the proper expectations at our table that this is going to be an engaging and exciting and fun session, fun encounter, then you can absolutely require 15 successes on a skill challenge. And it's going to take probably less time than a combat encounter of a similar size and scope, because you're not having to roll dice as the dungeon master. The environmental things, the NPCs they're interact with don't also roll. So that means that the players are constantly staying engaged. They're constantly talking. They're constantly looking at the environment, what they can do and what their party members are doing and how that's going to affect what they can do. And you can treat it like a combat encounter. Treat it like the centerpiece of your session, the big thing that your party is seeking to get to, and make it feel special. And that's the big thing that they talk about in this section of the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, is these are encounters. These are full-fledged encounters. These are not a segue to a bigger thing. Make this the thing, and your players are going to have a great time. So don't think that the complexity level 5 is the ceiling. Just keep that 2-to-1 ratio that they have here, and you'll be golden. And it also says, because 4th edition, obviously we were still very much tied to experience-based leveling. It talks about if you're doing a complex skill challenge that requires 12, 18 successes before they finish it, then make sure that you're rewarding experience as appropriate as a combat encounter would have been. Make sure that you're rewarding the players for overcoming this. You can determine this by putting a certain number of XP per required success if you want. And then it gets into determining, we have a little sidebar here. I do want to touch on like every aspect of this section of the book. We do have a little sidebar that's asking, is this a challenge? Basically stating if there's only one roll involved, then that's a skill check, not a skill challenge. Skill challenges are more complex than that. So just a good distinguishing thing. The level, the other part of step 2. So this is a little bit different because our skill modifiers don't increase the same way they did in 4th edition. So if you look in the 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, it has like level ranges 1 to 3, 4 to 6, so on and so forth. And the very easy, average, hard, very hard, impossible DCs change over time. Whereas the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide just has one set for very easy DC 5, easy DC 10, moderate DC 15, hard DC 20, 25, 30. So by going with that, then determining the level isn't as necessary, because, you know, our proficiency is going to go from 2 to 6. So we're getting a +4 increase, and then any ability score increases that we do over the course of a campaign as we're leveling from 1 to 20. So there's not going to be as much of a swing. So you may want to make a little bit of an adjustment if you're doing a skill challenge for like a level 10 or 12 party. You may want to bump all of these up by 5, where very easy is 10, or maybe bump it up a little bit per tier of play. If its proficiency has gone from +2 to +3, then maybe make that tweak, because they've had an ability score increase available to them. Their proficiency has gone up 1, and so maybe bump it up a little bit, because you want to reward the players for investing and things like that. But that's in the form of, that we're going to get into, determining what skills are primary skills for the skill challenge. And you don't want them to be super easy eventually. You want the NPCs that they're interacting with to become more complex and more dynamic to interact with. So you can increase the DCs when you're determining the moderate, the easy, the hard DCs. Additionally, it does talk about the fact, reduce the number of failures. Like, that's another way you can increase the level of it. As you determine the complexity, it's 8-4 is I think complexity level 3. 8 successes before 4 failures. Well, let's say I want to make it more difficult and add more tension. I can cut the number of failures in half. 8-2. So now I've determined my complexity is 3, but I crank the difficulty up. I crank the level up by cutting the amount of failures that they have in half. And that creates more tension. So yeah, that's one way that you can do this. This is the most finicky part, because the DC swing is so much different in 5th edition compared to 4th edition in terms of the numbers that the players are rolling on. So this one, kind of feel out your table, and don't be afraid to make it hard. Don't be afraid to crank the difficulty up a little bit, because just like a combat encounter, the monsters get more and more powerful as the player characters level up. So too should the skill challenges get more and more difficult as the players level up. And you can also tweak how much time a skill challenge is potentially going to take without sacrificing the complexity. So let's say you wanted it to be a fairly quick and dirty skill challenge. You could determine the complexity, let's say complexity level 3, once again, 8-4. Well, I don't want this to be hyper challenging. I want the party to feel like they're in control of the situation. Let's say that they are coming to the prince hat in hand. And so I'm going to make it easy DCs across the board. I'm going to keep it on the low end of, DC 15, DC 10, whatever level they may be at, manageable. But I don't want it to drag on if the dice are against them. So I'm going to cut the challenge rating cut the failures allowed in half. So 8-2 easy DCs. So they might sprint through those 8 successes. But if the dice are just against them that night, and you don't want it to become a slog, boom, boom, 2 failures. The prince retires for the night. He doesn't want to see them anymore. And we'll get to what happens after that point. Step 3, determining the skills required. So certain skills lead to natural solutions given different situations. Obviously, if it's a social encounter, then things like diplomacy, bluff, intimidate would be applicable. If it's a trekking through the wilderness, then survival, perception, maybe a little bit of investigation, nature would obviously be skills that just make sense. So what you're doing is giving thoughts to which skills make sense and then creating a primary list of skills. These are the skills that make sense for this situation. And you would also, when you're writing it out, write the reasoning for it. Like, what is the party specifically doing with this skill? So with nature, let's say they're trying to navigate through the wilderness towards a town. Well, making a nature check, being able to observe the layout of the vegetation, the plant life, the animals, and lead the party towards a river that will guarantee that they hit this town because the town is built on a river, let's say. So that's what the nature skill is doing. Whereas survival, looking for track and signs of life where other adventurers would have gone towards this town, etc. So that is what you're doing when you're creating your primary list of skills. The important thing, and you also determine the DC for each primary skill, because some DCs might be naturally more difficult than others. So survival, trying to trek through the wilderness, might be an easier DC than perception, which is less focused. You're looking around, you're just trying to notice things instead of hyper-focused on looking for tracks, looking for things that the survival skill encompasses. And then additionally, you want to keep a good mix of social skill, like social interaction skills, knowledge skills, and the more practical physical skills like athletics and acrobatics, just to make sure that everybody has something to do. And ideally, you want to try to find a way to incorporate a little bit of something for all your players to do so nobody feels left out. However, this is not the list of only skills that can be used. Players can use any other skill they want if they can justify it to you. But these fall under the category of secondary skills. So a secondary skill is one that you have not listed. You have to come up with the DC kind of on the fly. The player has to come up with the reasoning and justification like you did for all the primary skills. And they can only do it once. You can only use a secondary skill one time. Not a secondary skill, but that specific secondary skill. So if we are, trying to navigate through the woods, and I say I want to use, trying to think of a good kind of off the wall example. I say I want to use medicine. It's like, okay, because I know that in order for towns to thrive in this part of the world, a certain plant that fights off a common disease spread by insects in this area is necessary. So if I can find evidence of this plant and kind of the direction the plant grows in, then I'm going to know that that's the direction the town would be in. Or it could be, I could flip that and say, I'm going to look for where the plant has been clearly picked, because then that shows that people have been walking that way and picking this plant. It's like, okay, go ahead and make a medicine check. Okay. Yeah. You spot it. And you can move on that way. And the last thing with skill challenges, and this, or determining the skills, and this kind of goes into step 4, which is other conditions. Determine if there are any skills that are an automatic failure. This is primarily for like social skills, social interactions, where the example they give in the book is like you're negotiating with a duke, and intimidation. The duke refuses to be intimidated by people like the PCs. So any attempt to intimidate, regardless of how good the role is an automatic failure. However, in that same example, they had the insight skill listed as a primary skill. So using insight, you get some insight into the Duke's state of being, like what motivates him, all that kind of stuff. Additionally, it also says the first success with this skill reveals that the intimidate skill is an automatic failure. So if somebody did an insight check first, you would have known that. But if somebody just comes out of the gate with intimidate, automatic failure. And inform the player of that. Say, you can tell that the Duke refuses to be intimidated by you, and any attempted intimidation will not work regardless of how good the roll is. And so add those conditions. Additional other conditions that talks about is maybe the person they're discussing things with requires payment every 10 minutes that they're talking. And so maybe if they hit the failure threshold, failure doesn't mean the skill challenge is over. It's just you got to pay for more time, and you get to reset the failure count, perhaps. And so that's what's constantly keeping the clock moving, is this idea of, come on, we're getting low on gold. We can't keep paying this person. Or making the decision of like, you know what, not worth it. We're walking now. Or is there some environmental effect that is affecting the players throughout, to where if they take too long doing this, then they're going to be, a level of exhaustion or 2 levels of exhaustion, stuff like that. Maybe every time they hit the failure threshold, they gain a level of exhaustion. They can keep pushing forward, but it gets more difficult, and eventually you just have to make the call to retreat. So determine the other conditions for the skill challenge in that way. One thing it does talk about, though, if there is a monetary cost, if you're doing the payment thing, make sure that the reward for succeeding on the skill challenge compensates the players appropriately. Like if they have to pay 10 gold in order to get this meeting initially, make sure that success ensures that they get that 10 gold back. Now, if they fail over and over and they keep paying, you don't need to compensate them for all of their failings, but make sure that they're going to get compensated to a certain extent once they've succeeded on the skill challenge, whether that be, they get information about where this treasure is and they go, and so down the road they get recompensated, something like that. And also with the other conditions step, you want to consider any rituals or spells or combat checks that the players might try to use, and how to address that. So if it's a chase sequence, if they're trying to chase down an assassin that just killed an ally, and obviously you're going to have party members saying, well, I want to shoot at him. Okay, so if you think about that beforehand, you can say, it's a crowded street. It's extremely crowded. So they are going to have complete and total cover. You don't have good line of sight with them. And more so, if you're trying to shoot a bow, you're in a crowd. So you're like trying to elbow your way through people. So it's going to be an extremely difficult shot, extremely difficult. And you're probably going to hit somebody. Or there are town guards everywhere. And if they see you just randomly shooting, they are going to join the chase and try to arrest you. Same with casting offensive spells. And, you know, you might allow for advantage on skill checks if a player uses their turn to do a spell, do a ritual. Maybe that doesn't count as a success, but they give advantage to the next roll that relates to what they did. So think through those things, look at your player character sheets, and kind of think through the options that they're going to take that aren't skill. And then lastly, consequences. What does it mean to succeed in this skill challenge? What does failure mean? And obviously you should, much like a combat encounter, you should have failure not be a roadblock. Much like any skill check, failure should not be the end of the campaign. It should be an obstacle. Something is made more difficult. So if the negotiations with the prince fail, then the players just have to go it on their own. They are at a disadvantage. So encounters down the road, combat encounters or the adventure overhaul is just going to be more difficult than if they had gained the prince's favor. If they can't find the town, if they're trying to navigate through the woods and they can't find this town that they're trying to get to, well, what reason were they trying to get to town? Were they trying to get to the town to stop a nearby cult that was like abducting people and going to protect them? Well, maybe they eventually get there. It takes them a couple hours longer and a couple more people have been abducted. So, you know, that, and maybe it's a friendly ally of the PCs that has been abducted. And so they failed. So they are still able to progress, but there are consequences for that failure. And additionally, it gets into some of the math on rewarding experience for the skill challenge. So essentially, when you determine the level, which once again, we can't really do in 5th edition, but it's the level is the level of the monster, and the complexity is the number of monsters they would have defeated. So a level 7 monster in 4th edition rolls a 300 XP. So if it's a complexity 1, then they get 300 XP, like they killed one level 7 monster. Complexity 2 level 7s, so on and so forth, you get it. Okay, and I did skip past another sidebar that is something that I think is a phenomenal idea, and I think that everyone should do this at least once. Add a skill challenge to a combat encounter. Have them run at the same time. And this is great for like the end of a big adventure moment where, you know, I always think of the ancient occult ritual is going on trying to resurrect the Lich of Doom and their faithful lieutenant who is the one overseeing this ritual, and their goons are standing between the PCs and the ritual. And so the combat kicks off. Well, also add the skill challenge where if the number of failure hits, then the ritual is complete. But, and this isn't in the book, but this is what I would do, and what I would recommend you do. Every round that goes by where nobody addresses the skill challenge, automatic failure. So that way, that ticking clock is going, there's that sense of urgency. So if it's a complexity 2, which is 6 and 3, you just need 6 successes before 3 failures. 3 rounds of combat is going to go by quick. And if nobody's doing anything, that ritual is going to complete whether or not you have killed the lieutenant. The Lich is going to be resurrected. So somebody, even if it's just one person, has to be dealing with the ritual, whether it's the wizard doing an arcana check to counterspell the ritual, or it's the rogue sneaking around, like putting marks in the runes carved into the stone floor to disrupt the flow of the magics through it using stealth. Yeah, because they're sneaking about. So yeah, somebody has to do something about this other thing. We can't all be focused on fighting. So that is the way that I would incorporate a skill challenge on top of a combat encounter. And you could also do this with a chase scene. You could have some people focused on the combat, but somebody has to be focused on driving the carriage or the flying ship or whatever. Like somebody has to be focused on the skill aspect of this. Not everybody can be fighting, or else we're just going to keep slowing down and they're going to get further and further away. So that's how I would do that. Every round that goes by is an automatic failure. But if at least one person, if only one person, performs a skill check to try and address that using their action, using their turn to do that, then no automatic failure. They might fail on their skill check, in which case there's a failure. But and you can add additional rules if you want. If they're like engaged with an enemy, then they have disadvantage on the check or something like that. You can get as complex as you want, but just as a starting framework, that's the one rule that I would add to this, is every round that goes by, automatic failure. Okay, so now we have the running the skill challenge section. So this is actually, how do we do this? We have designed it. We've gone through the basics of how to build the skill challenge. We've defined everything with the primary skills, what the consequences are, the complexity, the level, etc. So it's just like a combat encounter. You describe the situation, define everything to the players, including the complexity. This is something that it talks about that I'll get into. There's another section, and have them roll initiative. It's just like a combat encounter. Roll initiative so we know the order that everyone's going in, and then everybody on their turn can either use a primary skill or a secondary skill one time. And it does say that secondary skills typically are just going to have a hard DC slapped on them, because it's not something that would be commonly used in this situation. It's kind of off the wall. So it's going to inherently be more difficult. So you want to keep secondary skills on an upper threshold. And it makes sense, because typically if somebody's pitching for a skill that's not a primary one, it's because they're really good at it. And so a higher DC isn't going to be that detrimental. But you want, with those secondary skill check pitches, for the justification to be baked into the pitch, not just, I want to make a diplomacy check. It's okay. Why do you want to make a diplomacy check? What are you going to do with diplomacy while we're trying to navigate through the woods? So you don't necessarily want to say no. You're not saying no. You are asking the player to explain a good reason why that skill would be applicable in this situation. If they come up with a good reason, then great, go for it. But if they can't, maybe come up with a different skill that you want to use. Also, opposed checks. Don't do them in skill challenges. If they're negotiating with an NPC, don't have the NPC roll like a saving throw or an insight against their deception. If you want to have the DC change based on the NPC, just do a passive. What's their passive insight? And have that be the DC for the deception check. But you shouldn't be rolling during a skill challenge. Okay, and another thing that I have run into oftentimes, and I'm so glad that they called this out, group skill checks. You should have group skill checks if they make sense. And when they make sense is when there's really only one skill that makes sense for a situation. So I remember I was doing a train heist skill challenge. Like, hey, you're trying to get on a train and secure a target. Okay. Well, the first round, everybody was on like their carriage up against next to the train. First round was everybody making an athletics check to get on the train, because that was the only thing that really made sense. I think one person made a perception check to try and like determine if there was a better door that they could get to, like in between the cars, they could just step over. In that kind of situation, call for a group skill check. The best whoever has the best athletic score in this particular instance makes the check on behalf of the group. But everybody else can make an athletics check, and anybody that gets above a 10 adds a +2 up to a maximum of +8 to that player's check. And their secondary rolls don't count as successes or failures towards the skill challenge, just the primary one does. But they get to still assist by everybody jumping over. And so that way, if one person fails, it can be like, oh, and I catch them and pull them up. Same with a stealth check to try and sneak up. If there's a scenario where it kind of feels like there's only one real option for that round, then it should be a group skill. Okay, especially when you're first starting out using these rules. If you're going to implement them at your table tomorrow, this section is called informing your players. Tell them what a skill challenge is. Break it down for them. You are trying to get X number of successes before Y number of failures. Here is the initial skill that makes sense. Like, here is the scenario that you're in. Here's what you're trying to accomplish. What skills make the most sense for you? Because you don't necessarily have to tell them all the primary skills. In fact, you can, in some of the examples, set it up to where like using one primary skill reveals another primary skill. So just tell them what makes sense in this situation and go with that. And then additionally, explain to them, like, if you fail, it's going to count towards the failures. If you succeed, it's going to count towards the successes. There may be some skills that you do that don't inherently count towards the success or failure, but they're just going to assist other player characters, not really whole lot of room for combat in this particular situation, talk to them, lay it out for them. Because if they don't know what's going on, then they're not going to be engaged and have fun. But if they understand the system that they're playing in, if they understand the rules, then they're going to have a great time with it. And so a great example it gives is if they're trying to sneak into a wizard's college, then saying something to the effect of your magical disguises, the bluff skill, and knowledge of the arcane are going to play a big role in this challenge. So they know out of the gate, okay, bluff and arcana are two primary skills in this. And once your players get more acclimated to the system, then you'll need to be less overt about it. But certainly starting out, you need to do that. There's a sidebar interrupting a skill challenge where typically, obviously, a skill challenge is going to flow through from beginning to end. But there may be an occurrence where combat breaks out in the middle of a skill challenge. The example it gives is like while you're negotiating with the prince, an assassin might jump in and try to kill, or a group of assassins, and the party has to jump into action to defeat the assassins. And once again, you determine the success and failure conditions of the combat encounter. This is something also I don't feel like I do a good job as a dungeon master, and I don't think it's talked about enough. When we're designing combat encounters, we should also define what success and failure looks like. Like, what does it look like if the party fails to win this combat encounter? But anyway, I'm just saying that should be a codified part of your planning. But if the players succeed in defending the prince against the assassins, then that counts as a success towards the overarching skill challenge. And so the next section is multiple skills engage multiple players. This is what I was talking about with the influence system from Pathfinder 2nd Edition in the previous video, where by having not only social interaction skills play into social interactions, you can engage your party as a whole. And so having the prince be a huge history nerd, or extremely religious, or a big fan of the local sports team. And so your athletic party member can use athletics in the social encounter to show off their impressive skills, or even like you could use it as justification to just talk athletics. It doesn't necessarily need to be a physical skill, even though it's based on strength, but you get what I'm saying. But you could have, or acrobatics, showing how dexterous they are. So you can have the prince be a big history nerd. So the player character who's the wizard, who has a terrible charisma, but a 20 in intelligence and proficiency in history, is going to be able to shine alongside the bard who has the crazy high charisma and the crazy high persuasion. So by engaging all these different party members, you then make the skill challenge all encompassing to where not one person feels left out, or only one person has the opportunity to shine. The book calls that, it would be like having only one person do all the fighting in a combat encounter. You want to avoid that, but you also want to allow everybody to be contributing in a meaningful way. And once again, it kind of reinforces, like, give the players the information they need to make smart choices. Don't be cagey with information when you're setting up a skill challenge. Give them the information they need to succeed, and then let their decision making and the dice determine whether or not they succeed or fail. A lack of information should never be the reason why the players fail at a skill challenge. Next section is reward clever ideas. So this is kind of talking about secondary skills, especially when players are, it says thinking players are engaged players. If your players are trying to think creatively about the problem they're trying to solve, then they are engaged. You have them and you want to keep them engaged. So saying yes to their pitches when they make sense and are made in good faith is the way to go. And so talks about if they're trying to track down a cult, one player character can ask, can I make a religion check to see if I know something about this cult and where they would build their temple? It's like, sure, that's going to be a hard DC because it's kind of esoteric knowledge, but go for it. And they succeed on the hard DC, and it's like, okay, yeah, this particular cult worships an entity that is said to spring forth from the water. So their temple is going to be near a river or a lake or something along those lines. So keep an eye out for that. And then another party member says, I want to make an athletics check to climb up to the top of a tree, the tallest tree I can find, to get a vantage point to see if I can spot a break in the trees, to see if I can spot a river or a body of water. Yeah. And, for a super athletic person, climbing a tree is an easy DC, so it doesn't make sense to make that hard just for the sake of making it hard. So yeah, it's an easy DC. Climb up. You can spot that. Now, you all can no longer use religion or athletics respectively in the skill challenge because you've done the one thing that skill would be good for in this particular situation. And then also you can call for skill checks during skill challenges, which I know may seem like circular. But what I'm saying is call for a skill check outside of the confines of the skill challenge. So maybe while they're negotiating with the prince, a member of the prince's court notices a party member doing something that breaks court etiquette and is appalled. And somebody needs to make a diplomacy check to calm down that member of the court and get them to be quiet. And so a success doesn't count as a success towards the skill challenge because it hasn't gotten you anywhere further with the prince. But maybe success means that somebody gets advantage on the next roll because the prince is impressed with your knowledge of the court and being able to navigate the politics of the court. And failure means disadvantage for the next 2 or 3 rolls because the prince does know, or 1 roll, depends, you do you, because the prince also notices the lack of etiquette and is kind of put back on like, oh, like, or maybe you make it a specific skill, like further diplomacy checks have disadvantage because clearly while you have a silver tongue, you don't actually understand my station and what I do, something like that. And then encounters have consequences. And this we kind of touched into when we were defining consequences of what happens as a result of the skill challenge, what good thing happens as a result of the success, what bad thing happens as a result of the failure. And you never want a skill challenge to be the, you know, the campaign breaking point. Ideally, I mean, you can, just depending on the campaign that you're running, but you know, success in a skill challenge should affect the course of action and the course of the adventure that the players have before them, to where the road ahead is easier or more difficult. Things should never stay the same after a skill challenge, because if they were just going to stay the same, then you shouldn't have done a skill challenge. So success should be a boon, failure should be a detriment. And one thing they do that I absolutely love, and again, this in the examples with like a chase sequence, it references throughout the description of these rules that I haven't touched on because the mechanic doesn't exist in 5th edition, but you know, making a survival check while, you know, navigating the forest, and a failure results in have everyone do a survival check, and anybody that fails as a result loses 1 hit die. It says healing surge, but hit die is a decent correlation to show the physical toll that the skill challenge is having on them. And it shows that in the other examples of like during a street chase, if you make an athletics check to try and jump over a barrier or navigate through some obstacles and you fail, lose a hit die because you're getting banged up and you're getting bruised. Failures on individual checks could also have consequences in addition to adding towards the failure of the overall skill challenge. So show the physical toll that the skill challenge is having on people as well. And doing something like a hit die is taking a resource away without directly affecting the character there in the moment. So it's not like you're knocking them prone or taking them out of the skill challenge altogether. They're just getting beat up as they're trying to get through this skill challenge. And so I just want to go through the initial negotiation example and how they have written out the setup for this, because I think there are some really good lessons to be taken from looking at this as well. So the setup is for the NPC, the Duke, to provide assistance. The PCs need to convince him or her of their trustworthiness and that their cause helps the NPC in some way. Level is equal to that of the party. Complexity 3 requires 8 successes before 4 failures. Primary skills: bluff, diplomacy, insight. So these are the primary skills that you communicate to the players. This is the primary skills. Like, so in order to discuss this situation with the Duke, you're need to rely on your silver tongue to navigate diplomacy. In D&D 5e would be persuasion, obviously, or perhaps a little bit of deception and double speak, or just trying to understand their motivation by gaining some insight into who they are as a person. Now you have communicated to the players. Persuasion, deception, insight are your primary skills. So looking at, and then they wrote out for the primary skills: bluff, moderate DC. You try to encourage the NPC to aid your quest using false pretenses. Characters can cooperate to aid a lead character using this skill. So once again, somebody can take the lead on deceiving and other people can make the deception check, like we talked about with that athletic skill to jump onto the train. People can make deception checks above a 10, adds a +2, because they're reinforcing, oh, yes, this is a dire situation, even if it's not. Diplomacy: you entreat the NPC for aid in your quest. First success with this skill opens up the use of the history skill. The NPC mentions an event from the past that has significance to them. So now we've unlocked another primary skill through success with one of the initial ones. So diplomacy the Duke responds with, "Oh yes, I understand the direness of the situation. I do not want a repeat of the Battle of Baba. And then it's like, okay. And you as the DM would tell them, okay, so now you understand that this battle holds some significance to the Duke. And so you can use the history skill as a primary skill to reinforce and discuss that event and how it relates to the situation going on, right? And then insight, you empathize with the NPC and use that knowledge to encourage assistance. First success with this skill reveals that any use of the intimidate skill earns a failure. So once again, you have communicated that insight is a primary skill. So if somebody just comes out of the gate with intimidate, which you did not say was a primary skill, they're going to earn an automatic failure. If they would have focused on the initial skills, they would have learned that. So you see how the system is set up for the players to succeed, but allows them to fail if they go off the tracks within the confines of the system that you have set up. And then history, easy DC. So history is actually the easiest DC listed. The other ones are moderate. And that's great because it's an unlock. You've unlocked it through succeeding on a more difficult DC. You make an insightful remark about the significant event from the NPC's past. This is available only after one character has gained a success using the diplomacy skill, and it can be used only once in this way during the challenge. So once again, it's an easy DC. You have unlocked it, but once you've engaged them in that way, then it's kind of a one and done deal. And then intimidate, the NPC refuses to be intimidated by the PCs. Each use of this skill earns a failure. So if somebody's just banging their head against the wall, they might beef the whole thing just because they refuse to not intimidate. But you should communicate once again when the first time they try to intimidate and they roll, or don't even have them roll. That's a better way to do it. Is I'm going to intimidate him. Okay, you attempt to intimidate him, but before you roll, it's an automatic failure. It is impossible to intimidate this person. And then you define success and failure in this little block. Success, the NPC agrees to provide reasonable assistance to the characters. This could include treasure. Failure, the characters are forced to act without the NPC assistance. They encounter more trouble, which may be sent by the NPC out of anger or antagonism. And then they write out a script for how this actually plays out. But I don't think we need to go into that. So that is skill challenges broken down in their entirety as they were originally presented in the D&D 4th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. No, like there were like one homebrew rule, I think, where if you're doing it in combat, every round that goes by where nobody addresses the skill challenge, add a failure. But everything else is just as presented in the book, and I think it is a phenomenal system. And I think if it is given the proper weight, like that of a combat encounter in a session, I think your players will be really engaged and really surprised by how inventive they can be and how diverse the skills they can use can be and how engaging something like this can be. So let me know what you think below. Have you run skill challenges, rules as written in the 4th edition DMG within 5th edition? Let me know how it went. Are you excited by these rules, or do you have a different system that you enjoy using? Let me know down below. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been Eric, and I will see you next time.